One Denver Broncos edge rusher has returned for the 2022 NFL season. Does this impact or change George Paton's strategy on the draft board, or should it? Plus, what are the Broncos' options at edge rusher depth right now for this upcoming season? We debate, we ponder, and we look further into it on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Rourke, joined alongside by my co-host, Sarah Bettinger. Both of us, we cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked On Network and 9 News. Broncos country, thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Plus, whether you listen to us on your favorite audio podcasting platform or you watch us here on YouTube, if you do either of that, make sure you hit that follow or that subscribe button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. Hey, Sarah, look, the Broncos back at it with their offseason program, and it's just a refreshing feeling, I think, seeing the players report back to the team facility at the UCL Training Center. We have some media availabilities that are coming up here this week that gives us a little bit more access to the players and to what's going on. And, hey, look, we got some Broncos news in the mix as well, with one key pass rusher returning in 2022.
That's right. Malik Reed back for the 2022 season. We were kind of wondering the other day, like, why hasn't he signed his restricted free agent tender? But maybe he was just waiting to be back in Denver on a full-time basis. Who knows what the deal was there? But Malik Reed back in the fold, and that really just it kind of entrenches that edge position. Of course, as we go into the NFL draft, where George Paton has stated, this is one of the deepest position groups in the entire draft this year. So it'll be interesting to see how all the players that the Broncos have lined up, which we're going to talk about on this episode of the show. How interesting is it going to be, Cody, to see what the pecking order is, how the Broncos prioritize edge in the draft, because a lot of fans think, hey, that should be the top pick for the Broncos coming up here in a couple weeks.
I think a lot of interesting perspectives here for George Paton to kind of have, and I know we're going to dive on that a little bit later on towards the end of the show. I really want to touch on the George Paton angle here, but for Malik Reed, one thing too, Mike Kliss, our 9 News reporter here, had tweeted out there and reported that Malik Reed will be getting first-team reps opposite of Bradley Chubb in training camp because of the fact that Randy Gregory underwent that shoulder procedure that should have him ready for the start of the season, but questionable for the start of training camp and questionable for training camp at that even matter there. So it's like, okay, hey, here's the thing. Malik Reed, a guy who has come in for the Broncos in the last couple of years and has been put into situations where he's needed to start, has done just that and has produced. I think that we could talk about maybe the consistency of pass rush effectiveness, getting home for quarterback sacks, but the fact that he has started and he's been consistent, especially against the run too, has been something I think is important for the Broncos. Now here, what expectations do we have for Malik Reed based on 2021? Well, last season, he started in 13 games for the Broncos and played in 14 of them. And in those 14 games, he had 5 sacks, 8 quarterback hits, 43 tackles, 22 QB pressures, and 14 quarterback hurries. So the production is there, right? Would we necessarily call that maybe starter emphasis in the NFL? Probably not here. Probably not for the Denver Broncos, but considering the fact that the team has asked him to do that in the past and he's been reliable in doing so, he can step in and he can do it. And hey, who knows? He could grow into a more evolved role this upcoming season, and he could be even better. That's one thing I like about the NFL.
Well, and I think the one reason why fans aren't fully on board the Malik Reed train is at this point, he hasn't really proven himself to be like the next Shaquille Barrett, right? I think that's kind of what everybody thought maybe he could become when the Broncos signed him out of Nevada a couple of years ago, but he hasn't quite been as impactful. The statistics seem to be there, right? I mean, the numbers that you just threw out there, those seem like pretty good numbers. I would have loved to have seen the Broncos sign somebody that got 22 quarterback pressures last season. And Malik Reed is a solid all-around player. I think there's a little bit of a lack of maybe splash or something like that. Yeah. It's not that we're looking for the flashy. It's not that we're looking for, him to be Von Miller, but there is a lack of those splash plays at times. And he has made some big plays to his credit, and he's done a great job coming as an undrafted free agent who didn't even play full-time on the edge in college. He was kind of all over the place. So I feel like the Broncos have gotten a lot out of Malik Reed, and maybe that's kind of where the disconnect between the fan perception and the team perception is. Maybe the fans' perception is the Broncos have gotten the most out of Malik Reed that they can, whereas the front office and coaching staff perspective is this is a guy that can still really help us. We know Malik Reed is a key piece on special teams as well, Cody. So for him to be going into camp as the presumptive starter, maybe that does ramp up your draft discussion to say, hey, we need to have somebody that can come in and push him for that spot right away.
It's exciting to look at maybe the potential angles that George Paton, this coaching staff, a brand new coaching staff that has not worked with him previously, will have a chance to come in with fresh eyes and a fresh perspective to be able to see maybe what he can do to contribute. And look, I think maybe that could be very important for Malik Reed and also just for the rest of the edge rushers that are on this football team. But there is another edge rusher, another rotational guy that is often left out of the mix, and that is Jonathon Cooper, the Broncos' 7th-round standout from last season. We're going to talk about him and maybe his impact in 2022 coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all the sports betting stats and information that you need this season. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. As we jump into the second half acts on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, talking about Jonathon Cooper out of Ohio State. Real quick, before we get into that, I just want to thank Broncos Country so much for making Locked On Broncos their first listen of the day every single day. Locked On Broncos, we're here for you every single day, all year long, all the Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage that you need from an objective point of view. And we also like to include you, the audience, in the show and what we do with mailbags. And obviously, we love to respond on YouTube and on Twitter. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. If you haven't done so already, smash that like button for the algorithm. But Sarah, let's continue on with our discussion on today's episode of the show here. Jonathon Cooper, a player I think for us, we were wondering about too, because I think that going into last year's NFL draft, the fact that he fell all the way to round 7, I think it's safe to say that it was based on the medical concerns that a lot of teams had about a heart issue that he had a surgery on. He had a procedure to correct the issue, and he was ready to go for the start of preseason. And man, I tell you what, if it weren't for Jonathon Cooper in the preseason, would we have seen him in 2021? I mean, he had one of those impactful preseasons, kind of similar to guess who we just talked about, Malik Reed. And I think for Jonathon Cooper, his talent is way more than what we saw as a 7th-round pick for him. I mean, he could have went in round 3. He could have went maybe round 4, but he is an impact player who has such a high motor. And what did we talk about during training camp? What did we hear about in training camp? Jonathon Cooper's motor is relentless. This guy just keeps going. And in the regular season, we were able to see that with him. Now, here's something I want to pinpoint too. He's got experience starting for the Broncos. He started in 5 games for Denver in 2021 as a 7th-round rookie selection here for George Paton's award-winning draft class, by the way. And he played in 16 games for the Broncos. I mean, Sarah, this is a guy that has all the potential in the world, in my opinion, I think, to be molded into a very pivotal and impactful role here for this Broncos team in 2022 and potentially beyond.
Well, he's the ideal back end of the roster type of guy, right? He's a special teams guy. It's so ironic that he had heart issues coming into the NFL, because to be corny for a second here, Cody, the guy plays with just a ton of heart. I mean, he's all effort, all intensity. He is that guy who is kind of like, just the catalyst for other people to have energy. I mean, other people feed off of his energy. He's the thermometer, and when he's hot, I think everyone around him becomes hot as well. I love that about him, and I think you just get that vibe from him. And that, you're right, his preseason was dominant. I mean, he showed those explosive traits, like we said about Malik Reed, kind of lacking those explosive traits in regular season play, whereas he did kind of show them in preseason a couple years back. Jonathon Cooper has those explosive traits. He's a high-level athlete. We talk about RAS scores, relative athletic scores, all the time on this show, and Jonathon Cooper is up there. So he's a great athlete. He's a great teammate. He's got a lot of heart, and he's got a lot of energy. And so for me, maybe let us know in the comments what you think about this. If it comes down to a situation where the Broncos do draft someone, Cody, and they have to eventually choose between Malik Reed and Jonathon Cooper, Do you choose the guy that has actual starting experience, or do you choose the guy maybe with the higher upside? I feel like that would be a really tough decision. But Jonathon Cooper did show a lot in 2021 to me to prove that he can be a viable option off the edge going forward in his NFL career.
I think those are fair points that you made too. And talk about impact as well, right? We talk about defensive impact. Obviously for him, some starting experience there, even in a rotational role for him. He played 45% of the Broncos defensive snaps last season, and he played 62% of the team's special team snaps in 2021. This tells me we're going to see a ton of Jonathon Cooper on special teams this upcoming season, and maybe even more than 45% of the defensive snaps. I think a lot will be contingent upon how the Broncos want to platoon things personnel-wise defensively. This is going to be something that's going to be a task for Ejiro Evero and his staff, and obviously the other defensive assistant coaches to really collaborate on. And hey, like kind of like basketball, it depends maybe on the matchup. Maybe if you need a guy who's athletic, who you know can keep contain off the edge of the line of scrimmage against faster guys, maybe even athletic quarterbacks. The Broncos will play guys like Lamar Jackson here in 2022. Maybe you keep Jonathon Cooper in for that reason. I just remember a standout game against the Philadelphia Eagles this past season. Unfortunately, the Broncos lost the game, but Jonathon Cooper, stride for stride, outside contain against Jalen Hurts, did a fantastic job, and he has the traits, I think, to be a plug-and-play fit. I mean, if the Broncos really go with an option, they could have a deep edge rotation kind of similar to the 2015 Broncos season here. But let's even talk about production. Now, in the 5 games that he started in, and obviously all the games he appeared in, 2.5 sacks for him on the season, 15 quarterback pressures, 8 quarterback hurries on 21 blitz attempts, and he had 38 tackles and 7 QB hits. So when we talk about a limited condensed sample size of 45% of the defensive snaps, you look at that production, you say, okay, hey, there's some outlying traits here with this player. I tell you what, he might be just the Broncos' secret weapon on the defensive side of the ball that's young and has a lot of potential to continue to grow. I mean, your thoughts on maybe how the Broncos could utilize him here in 2022?
Well, I think definitely, like you mentioned, increased snap count has got to be on the docket, potentially at least. And I wonder, if Malik Reed is going to get just the lion's share of starter snaps if Randy Gregory is out. Do they maybe try to split those up with Jonathon Cooper a little bit? Because like you mentioned, he got some time in that role last year. I think he proved enough last season, Cody, to really be that kind of a guy for you to say, hey, we believe in his starter potential. So we're going to show it by giving him some starter reps. We're going to let him go against Billy Turner. We're going to let him go up against Garrett Bowles. We're going to let him do those things and try those things in practice, because we believe in that potential. And I think that a lot of times as we go into the draft season, one thing that gets forgotten a lot about players that are already on the roster is year 2, year 3 progression. Guys get better in the NFL, and so you just can't bank on it all the time. Like, we can't just sit here and say, well, let's pass on the best possible edge rusher the Broncos could get in the draft because Jonathon Cooper is on the roster. That's not what I'm saying, but I do think that there is some value to investing in a guy, pouring into him and saying, hey, we're going to give you additional opportunities in the offseason while Randy Gregory is healing from that shoulder procedure, and really see how he responds to that. We can't see, there's no games right now, right? It's not even OTAs officially. It's in the voluntary conditioning part of offseason activities. But at the same time, I think the sentiment applies. And I think that when they do get out there on the field, it'll be fascinating to see how much bigger, how much stronger, how much faster is Jonathon Cooper, how much smarter is he at playing off the edge, how much better is he recognizing things. I think you base his role in 2022, Cody, off of how much he's progressed in those areas based on what this coaching staff saw on tape from a season ago.
Well, how big is the Broncos' need at edge rusher, or is it amplified a bit? Is George Paton playing the wait-and-see game with edge depth right now? We pose that question coming up here in just a moment, Broncos country. But before we do that, let me tell you about rockauto.com. And if you need anything for your vehicle, rockauto.com has everything. Now, for me, I've purchased brand new floor mats. I've purchased brand new steering wheel covers because the Colorado heat in the summertime, the UV rays melt the metal on your steering wheel, and you always got to protect that as well. Plus, I've even gotten frost blockers for the winter. I've gotten heat covers for the summer to protect my leather interior on my vehicle. RockAuto.com is a family-owned business that's been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. 20 years of reliable service from a family-owned business. That's why I rock with RockAuto.com. Outside of that, too, prices are always reliably low, whether you're a professional or a do-it-yourselfer, and you can quickly navigate through the RockAuto.com website. You can see the brand of your car by year, make, model. You get to choose the brands and specifications of different parts for your vehicle. Easy to click in one place, and they deliver it directly to your doorstep at rockauto.com. So go to rockauto.com right now to see all the parts available for your car, truck, right? Locked On Broncos in there. How did you hear about us box? So that they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. And as we prepare for the fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, diving into whether or not the Broncos' edge depth is needed in this year's NFL draft, or is it okay for 2022? We pose those questions on both sides of the table. But before we do that, once again, thank you so much, Broncos Country, for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. We appreciate you so much. The Locked On Podcast Network has a show for you for all your favorite sports. If you're an NBA fan and you're a Colorado sports fan, check out the Locked On Nuggets podcast. Playoffs start this weekend against the Golden State Warriors. Adam Mares and Matt Moore have you covered with all the pick and roll action you need on all things Denver Nuggets. But Sarah, my friend, let's continue on with today's episode of the show. Now, we've talked about Malik Reed's return here. We talked about Jonathon Cooper, who is often forgotten in this conversation here. And I myself have been very guilty of that too when thinking about just the Broncos edge rushers in general. But then all of a sudden, you take a look at where the Broncos are at right now with Malik Reed finally signing his tender. I started to think immediately about the fact that, hey, I wonder if edge rusher is as significant of a need, maybe in the eyes of the Broncos organization, more so than it is in mine or maybe yours or like other Broncos fans. And the reason I say this, okay, Randy Gregory is expected to be ready for the start of the season. Okay, you have him. You have Bradley Chubb. Those are going to be your two anticipated week one starters in a sense when fully healthy between these two guys. Okay, now you have Jonathon Cooper, you have Malik Reed, but then all of a sudden there's the introductory wild card of Baron Browning, who's going to play this hybrid inside backer and edge rusher role in certain situations, and not to mention Andre Mintz is on the roster still at this point. So are the Broncos seriously looking into edge rusher as much as maybe we might think that they should or that they need to? There's a lot of questions here about how might Baron Browning's potential role impact them on the draft board.
Well, I'm glad you brought all those guys up, including Andre Mintz, because, man, you forget he made the roster last year when Von Miller was undrafted. When Von Miller was still on the team, Andre Mintz made it. And that's pretty crazy considering Jonathon Cooper made it. Malik Reed was still there. I mean, it was a wild time. So definitely he's a name worth bringing up as well. Aaron Patrick, also a guy the Broncos plucked off of waivers and kept all year last year. So can't forget any of these names, in my opinion, because, hey, I mean, we almost counted out Jonas Griffith last year. At least I did on this podcast. And then all of a sudden he comes out and looks like he could be a future starter for you at inside linebacker. But to the point about Baron Browning, Cody, I think it's absolutely huge. If he plays more of the Justin Hollins type of role that we alluded to on a previous episode, that would mean that he's going to be playing way less inside linebacker and way more off the edge and way more on special teams potentially. And I love the idea of him playing off the edge. And I have since before he was even drafted by the Broncos, back when Micah Parsons was an option at 9. I figured, man, if you could take somebody else at 9 and get Baron Browning later, you'd be getting kind of a 2-for-1 type of deal, because Baron Browning does a lot of the same things well that Micah Parsons did in college. Not to the same degree, of course, but obviously both tremendous athletes with big-time speed, explosiveness. You've got to get those traits off the edge if Baron Browning can win, because he's super strong. And I don't know how many people watched the 2021 Senior Bowl, but Baron Browning did a lot of stuff off the edge during practices back at the Senior Bowl. And we're seeing a couple of Twitter videos pop up of him kind of working on his hands and that type of stuff. I think this is something that he was bred for, Cody. So I'm with you in bringing this up. I think it's worth at least questioning. Do the Broncos need edge in the NFL draft as much as maybe it's perceived? Should they go after an edge at all costs at pick number 64? I'm just not so sure. You read off all these names and you think about, hey, what is the front office and the pro scouting department and the coaching staff? What are they saying about these guys' development going forward. And what do they really think about him? I guess the proof will be in the pudding in a couple weeks when these draft picks start rolling in on day 2 and the Broncos have some selections. But man, I can't help but think the same thing as you in regards to this. Do the Broncos really need an edge that much because you got all these young players?
Well, the thing that I'm looking at too is like, what's George Paton's mindset? Like, here's the thing. Like, one thing I've loved about George Paton, and we've talked about this, hundreds of times on this podcast. There's no leaks that really get out. Like the Broncos, if there's certain players that are visiting for pre-draft visits, I almost have the assumption like, okay, these are players the Broncos aren't going to choose in the NFL draft just because of the secrecy that George Paton kind of operates in. Like he is truly like the James Bond of general managers right now. But is George Paton kind of paying, geez, that was a little bit of a tongue twister. Is George Paton playing the wait and see game here at edge rusher? And the reason I asked that too, okay, you just signed Randy Gregory to this deal. He's going to be in Denver for the next 5 years, 3 to 5 years potentially here. But this is also a very massive year for Bradley Chubb, former first-round pick for the Broncos in 2018. This is a make or break season, I think, in the eyes of many people for Bradley Chubb. And look, if Bradley Chubb has a huge year, Sarah, he'll be back with the Broncos. George Paton will pay him. So is this him kind of playing the wait and see game because of the fact that he wants to see if Bradley Chubb can take that next step rather than bringing in a guy in the NFL draft when you have all these other guys? Could you look at it next year potentially? I always think it's an interesting perspective to look at for the GM spot. Do you do that move now or do you wait and see? I mean, the Broncos haven't waited and see, especially with the quarterback position. And even like last year at right tackle, everyone was talking about, are they going to draft a tackle? George Paton played the wait and see game. Could he do it here with edge rusher?
I mean, I think it's a possibility. Absolutely. And, the thing with Bradley Chubb is George Paton can't say enough good things about him, right? Every time the name Bradley Chubb comes out of George Paton's mouth, it's associated with core player, somebody that they really believe highly and they really believe strongly that he's going to be this XYZ in 2022. Everything that Paton has said about Bradley Chubb is the same kind of stuff that he said about guys like Tim Patrick and Cortland Sutton before they got big-time contracts. So I think that's something to keep in mind, Broncos country, as we talk about Bradley Chubb and his future. The organization is extremely high on Bradley Chubb, and they believe the best from him because they've seen what he can be. We saw in his rookie season, he almost broke Javon Kearse's rookie sack record back in 2018. So when he's healthy and at his best, he's a high-impact player. I know he's not necessarily Von Miller, but he's a high impact edge player. So that factors into this whole conversation potentially. But I think that's where you do maybe hedge your bets. We see a lot of top 30 NFL draft visits rolling in, Cody, here in the last few weeks. And the Broncos haven't really been bringing in a lot of edge guys, which is fascinating because either that means, like you said, he's trying to misdirect and say, hey, we're really kind of keeping this open-ended as to who we're bringing in. But then they bring in a guy like D'Angelo Malone out of Western Kentucky, the former Conference USA Defensive Player of the Year. And you say, well, maybe he's a great option at this point of the draft. Or maybe, maybe he's their favorite option. I don't know. Maybe he's their least favorite option and they're trying to throw off the scent. That's the beauty of the NFL draft. The Broncos have brought in 30 interior offensive linemen, it feels like, for pre-draft visits. And then they'll probably go the complete opposite direction and take somebody at, safety or something crazy. So it's all misdirection at this point. But the fact that they haven't brought in a ton of edge rushers for pre-draft visits, I don't know if you can necessarily read into that, but it's at least something to think about if they're really differentiating between top guys at pick number 64.
How often is it that we all sometimes forget about Bradley Chubb's rookie season? I feel like it's forever ago because it really wasn't in the Vic Fangio era. It was Vance Joseph's final season as the Broncos head coach. I just remember that game, Thursday Night Football, Von Miller and Bradley Chubb just destroying the Cardinals offensive line and Josh Rosen. And I remember the big breakout game against the Los Angeles Rams, who went to the Super Bowl and obviously had a performance in there. I think that there's a lot of optimism about what Bradley Chubb can do if he can stay fully 100% healthy this season. I think he could be a tremendous impact player for Denver. I think they'll take care of him. And I hope that's the case because you want to be able to extend guys to second contracts. That's a goal that George Paton has now. He wasn't the guy who drafted Bradley Chubb, but surely he'd love to be able to keep that extension branch going of the Broncos organization. So, Sarah, loved your insight on today's episode of the show. Broncos country, let us know down below in the YouTube comment section your thoughts on the Broncos depth at edge rusher, your thoughts on George Paton. Smoke and mirror season is upon us. We're curious for your thoughts as well. If you want to tweet us at Cody Rourke NFL, at Sarah Bettinger, at Locked On Broncos. And make sure you smash that like button and make sure you're subscribed to this show on your favorite audio podcasting platform or here on YouTube if you have not done so already. Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the show. Tomorrow's episode of the show is going to be a very special treat for all of you, especially for me. I'm a defensive back guy. We will be talking about the cornerbacks and which cornerback targets could the Broncos target in the later rounds in the 2022 NFL Draft in rounds 2, 3, and potentially 4. A lot of options there. We break down some of the prospects on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.